Vivien Leigh will be forever remembered for the most famous female film role of all time.
She was the biggest star of the biggest film ever made.
I'm not cornered. You'll never corner me, Red Butler. Oh, frightened.
Her affair and 20-year marriage to Laurence Olivier was the most scandalous and glorious love story of its time.
What she had with Olivier was absolute magic, and then it became absolute hell.
I never lied in my heart.
But behind her glamorous success as a film and theatre star, she faced a lifelong battle against mental illness, which ultimately destroyed her.
When she was high, she was very high indeed and almost uncontrollable. When she was low, she was extremely low and almost suicidal.
Liar!
What?
But above all, she was a movie star par excellence.
Vivien Leigh was born Vivien Mary Hartley in India in 1913, the only child of wealthy British parents.
Vivien had, I suppose, what you could call a very comfortable lifestyle. The family didn't lack money. There were plenty of servants. It was a very highly coloured childhood, and there were plenty of people to pay her attention.
I think that her parents lived quite a good life. They were really based in Calcutta, but like all families, they would go up into the hill stations at certain times of the year. And I think she had a very nice early childhood. She was described as being not a sleepy baby, which is something which went on through life. She was always very awake and very energetic.
Vivien was headstrong and spoilt, and nothing prepared her for the shock of returning to English society.
She was sent over to Roehampton, to a very good Catholic school for girls. But you can imagine the contrast between leaving colourful and pleasurable India and warm India and arriving in bleak, cold Roehampton. I tend to think that that abrupt break may have attributed to it some of the troubles that she later suffered from.
Vivien was nearly 2 years younger than any of the other girls at her convent school, and she didn't see her mother again for nearly 2 years.
She said there were two things for which I will always be grateful. She said I'll be grateful for a lot of things, but she said one was that the Mother Superior taught me always have clean underwear. She said clean underwear was absolutely vital. It was like a religion. And she said the other thing was she knew I was lonely because my mother brought me from India and just went back, and I was left in this school. And in the school holidays, nobody invited her to go away anywhere. She said she was alone in the convent with all the nuns, and the Mother Superior gave her a little kitten, a little cat, and she said, you can take that to bed with you. And she said, I had this little companion.
Vivien's reaction was to draw attention to herself whenever she could, as one of her school friends, fellow actress Maureen O'Sullivan, remembers.
Vivien never changed in looks at all. She was always a beautiful little girl. I remember we used to do silly things in school, like voting for the most popular or the most pretty or the most talented or the most likely to be outstanding in the world. And I remember Vivien Leigh got the vote. Well, Vivien always wanted to be an actress. She was single-minded. She was the only girl in the school to take ballet, for instance. She took it alone. The only one. It was rather brave of her.
In 1927, Vivien's parents returned home to Britain, and together they travelled around Europe in luxury until the money ran out.
Ernest had big financial setbacks in the crash in the late 20s. So when they came back to England, they retreated to the West Country, to Devon, and lived rather modestly. I do get a sense that she was very keen to move on in life and escape from her family. I mean, she was fond of her family, certainly later on, but the only escape for a girl who wished to get out of her family at a very early age, of course, was marriage.
She saw this handsome young Englishman on a horse in a red coat from one of the hunts, riding through the streets, and he obligingly took his hat off and tipped it to Vivien. She said, "Who's that?" And she was told that was Lee Holman, a young barrister. And she said, "He looks so handsome, I'm going to marry him." She was told that he was already engaged, and Vivien said, "That doesn't matter, I'll make him my husband."
By 1932, they were married. Vivien may have got her man, but she had no intention of settling down to a quiet domestic married life.
He was a very, very nice man and actually proved to be the mainstay of her life in many, many respects. Very good looking and sort of keen at rowing and all these things. I mean, he would have been somebody that any young girl would have felt was a very reassuring, good potential husband to be.
When they got married and settled down in London, Vivien discovered that domestic life with Leigh rather lacked the romanticism of setting her cap at Leigh and making him her husband. And she prevailed upon her husband to let her go to the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art that had been founded only a year before.
She was a high-spirited girl who wanted to do anything. One must never forget, she was devastatingly pretty. She would stand out in a crowd of anybody, and she had friends who were there and the circles that she moved in. So it was the most natural thing in the world to want to go to RADA, which is not quite the same as wanting to act.
Vivien's ambitions had to be put on hold when she fell pregnant, but she was hardly enthusiastic about motherhood.
Maternity really didn't agree with Vivien. She described it as a rather messy business. I'm not going to do that in a hurry again. And she simply entered in her diary, had a baby. Not even had a daughter, or had a daughter called Suzanne, but had a baby. And it must have been a rather disconcerting sign for her husband to realize that his wife's mind really wasn't on establishing a household around him, but on pursuing her career outside the house.
Thanks to my husband Leigh's success as a barrister, I hardly had to miss a moment pursuing my career or my studies at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art. We had a nurse and a maid.
American actress Marcy Lafferty performs as Vivien Leigh in a show about her life. Her Vivien character tells her story in an imaginary press conference in 1960.
Of course, I was a fan of Vivien Leigh. I mean, it resulted in a play and a life's work almost. But I think most of all, she was completely inspirational to me on so many levels, as a woman, as someone who just saw all possibility and made it come true.
Vivien appeased her husband by taking his Christian name, Leigh, as her new surname. Her RADA connections brought several minor roles in film and theatre before, in 1935, she got her big break.
The enormous hit she scored when she started acting in the theatre was a play which I was lucky enough to see with Mary called The Mask of Virtue.
The fact that I was young and unknown, it caught the imagination of the audience. The roar of applause at the final curtain told me that the miracle had happened. I had arrived.
She made a stunning debut, and of course, they all raved about her looks, but one or two had the sense to see that she could act.
Vivien was, I think, very much an overnight sensation. Mask of Virtue, she got huge, huge amounts of publicity. What is amazing about her is that it wasn't just a one night off, it wasn't a one-off production, that she did maintain and sustain that level of interest throughout her life.
Her ambitions drew her inexorably to the man who would become the great love of her life, Laurence Olivier.
There is an extraordinary story that she went to see him in a play and declared, you know, that's the man I'm going to marry. And a friend of hers who was with her had to point out, well, actually you are already married. But this is all part of the kind of, the sort of ruthless ambition in that, you know, various people were to be cast by the wayside in those early days until she achieved what she really wanted. Olivier himself tells the story of how he was visited by her in the dressing room and she planted a kiss on the back of his neck, and that was obviously a big turning point.
Laurence Olivier would become the greatest actor of his generation, but at the time he was struggling, and he was also married. His wife, Jill Esmond, was pregnant as well, but once again, Vivien was prepared to go to any lengths to get her man.
She knew that he and his wife Jill Esmond were holidaying in Capri, and she engineered a holiday there too. She went along with a chaperone called Oswald Fruin, a friend of Leigh Holman's, as a kind of cover. And it must have been a very interesting foursome. Jill Esmond certainly knew what was going on. Olivier was afflicted with guilt. Vivien was like Scarlett O'Hara pursuing her new conquest. And Oswald Fruin was sitting there, really, I suspect, wondering what he'd got himself into.
It wasn't very long after that that they were involved in this very long and complicated and furtive affair, which, of course, must have been exciting on the one hand and riddled with guilt on the other hand.
The turning point came when Hamlet was staged in Denmark. And no one quite knows what happened then. But when Laurence Olivier and Vivien returned to England, they quit their respective spices and set up home together.
It was a very traumatic thing to do in 1936 or 7. Vivien, you know, threw away the security of a rich husband, Lee Holman, a safe house, a baby, a nanny, a structure, to go off with Larry, who was at that time not, you know, Sir Laurence Olivier, head of the British Theatre. He was a struggling actor with also a very difficult romantic past. She went through a lot of agony.
Together they bought Durham Cottage as a haven from the public scandal created by their affair. But Vivien's desire for celebrity matched her passion for Olivier. She actively encouraged magazines to publish features on their romantic lifestyle, which fueled their celebrity couple status.
She was a great homemaker and she had exquisite taste. She was a much more rounded person than Olivier. I mean, he was you know, an absolute genius with the stage and later on in films. But there wasn't very much more to him than that, I don't think. Whereas Vivien, her mind was much more alert to other things.
They had this divine little cottage. Vivien was sitting in the little drawing room there, and Mary suddenly said to me, "That is the most beautiful woman I've ever seen in my life." And she truly was. She was quite staggering and even better looking face to face than on the screen, because she had this staggering beauty with the eyes and the colouring. She was a wonderful looking woman.
In 1938, Olivier headed for his first Hollywood leading role in Wuthering Heights, while Vivien was acting on stage in London. It was then that she heard about a new Hollywood talent search, instigated by top MGM producer David O. Selznick, for the part of Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind.
He literally sent people out, particularly to the southern states of America, going around organizing open auditions where hundreds of would-be Southern belles would come in costume often, and do their little Scarlett turn. Now, as time went on, they realized that they were never going to find anyone in these open calls, and they started seriously testing actresses.
Hollywood itself got absolutely fed up with all of this. And Jack Warner himself said to me, "Oh, you don't want to be in Gone with the Wind." He said, "That's going to be the biggest bust in town."
Vivien had set her heart on getting the role of Scarlett O'Hara, whatever it took.
Vivien read Gone with the Wind like the rest of the world, and she was quite an unknown British actress. By her own admission, not very good.
She had been preparing herself for the part for years. She knew passages from the book by heart. This was just her. She believed it was her.
She said, "You know, I'm going to play Scarlett O'Hara," and which is ridiculous. And 2 years later, she landed the role, which is impossible.
She travelled to America to join Olivier, determined to find a way of auditioning for the role. Once in LA, she got Olivier's agent, Myron Selznick, brother of the producer David, to help her. David Selznick was filming the dramatic burning of Atlanta with stand-ins, and as the flames were dying down, Myron arrived on set with Vivien dressed as Scarlett O'Hara.
Myron is supposed to have taken Vivien, without David knowing a word about this, to the set, and he is supposed to have said something like, "Hello, genius," because he teased his brother a lot. "Here's your Scarlett." It turned out to be one of the great casting coups of all time. She was right for Scarlett because she was beautiful, because she was fiery, because she was crazy, because she submitted to the incredible ordeal of the filming, where she was working nearly every day in heavy costumes under Technicolor lights, which is like shooting in Death Valley in summer.
The filming of Gone with the Wind was traumatic for cast and crew. 3 separate directors were hired by Selznick. The sets were considered too fake, the early shots were too dark, and the cameraman fired. The script was constantly rewritten moments before scenes were recorded, and the film went massively over budget. For Vivien, the part of Scarlett was all-consuming. Mentally and physically exhausted, she chain-smoked on set, pushing herself to give the performance of her life.
Can't we ever forget that day at 12 Oaks?
Do you think I could ever forget it? Have you forgotten it? Can you honestly say you don't love me?
No, I don't love you.
It's a lie.
Well, even if it is a lie, do you think I'd go off and leave Melanie and the baby?
When I think of what was riding on that poor woman, I have candids of her taken on set. She is exhausted. She is exhausted. She was in every scene almost. They worked her and changed the dialogue. She had to learn how to speak Southern. She had all those costume changes.
She stood up to the strain and delivered a really great performance.
I'm not cornered. And you'll never corner me, Red Butler, or frighten me. You've lived in dirt so long you can't understand anything else. And you're jealous of something you can't understand. Good night.
It's not that easy, Scarlett. You turned me out while you chased Ashley Wilkes, while you dreamed of Ashley Wilkes. This is one night you're not turning me out.
Vivien Leigh always said she and Scarlett had nothing in common. And it's amazing that she saw herself that way, because she and Scarlett were so alike, they were peas in the pod. Vivien's whole life was willful, regardless of consequences, just as Scarlett's was. Vivien would do anything to get what she wanted, just as Scarlett had to.
I love you more than I've ever loved any woman. And I've waited longer for you than I've ever waited for any woman.
Let me alone.
Kiss me once.
As soon as Gone with the Wind was released, its impact was dramatic and immediate.
It was an enormous success, and Vivien knew stardom in a night. And the legend of Gone with the Wind reached out and enveloped her for the rest of her days.
Gone with the Wind was next premiered in New York City, simultaneously in 2 theaters, to accommodate the greatest crowds in the entertainment history of Broadway. Crowds which had anticipated the gala occasion for months and months.
I just knew that Gone with the Wind was going to have a history, a future and a history, quite unlike any other film that had ever been made. And I wasn't wrong, was I?
I would say without question it's the most popular film of all time. This is a film that cost $4 million, awful lot in 38, 39. And Variety's current chart, it's made $400 million. So pound for pound, bangs for the bucks, that's more money than Star Wars, than Birth of a Nation, than anything, because more people actually saw the film.
Need I say it is a privilege and an honor to announce this winner, Miss Vivien Leigh in Gone.
Ladies and gentlemen, please forgive me if my words are inadequate in thanking you for your very great kindness. If I were to mention all those who've shown me such wonderful generosity through Gone with the Wind, I should have to entertain you with an oration as long as Gone with the Wind itself. So, if I may, I should like to devote my thanks on this occasion to that composite figure of energy, courage, and very great kindness, in whom all points of Gone with the Wind meet, Mr. David Selden.
Almost overnight, Vivien went from being virtually unknown to the biggest star Hollywood had ever produced.
You can't imagine, at that time, there was no television, there was a little theatre in America, but the cinema was enormous. And she was Scarlett O'Hara, the biggest star of the biggest film ever made. And Larry at that time was not doing very well, and he was very overshadowed, I think, by her immense stardom.
When Olivier saw the film, he was amazed, he was excited, he was astounded, he was impressed, and he was furious, because he realised then that she was very much better than he was on film.
She understood the camera far better than Larry. Larry was always very stagey. Rather like Gielgud, he treated the camera as something that photographed a play. Vivien understood something quite different about the camera, that you made love to it, that you went in close, that you understood the camera was your entire audience. Larry was always doing it for the room, for the studio, for the audience. Vivien was doing it for the lens. And she understood, like a lot of Americans, that the film world required a totally different technique.
In the summer of 1940, both the couple's divorces came through and they were married. The Oliviers moved into the magnificent Notley Abbey in Buckinghamshire, their home for the next decade. Weekends at Notley were a magnet for many celebrities, with the Oliviers the king and queen of British high society.
Well, Larry really should have been walking about all the time with a sword and a scabbard and a bow and arrows, and so Notley was absolutely perfect for him. It was a castle, and it had battlements, and it had everything, you know. I mean, it fitted the Oliviers perfectly, and it was a focus for the weekends. We had wonderful weekends at Notley Abbey. We had marvellous parties, mostly playing cards till dawn. They had this wonderful combination of being very glamorous but very, very funny. They were hugely successful, and a very, very romantic marriage. They were just wonderful.
They were akin to royalty within the theatre. They were at the peak. They were A1 celebrities plus. And it's very easy to forget that now in this era of celebrity. They were very much, I think, the first of, if you like, the golden celebrity couple. They were the leaders of their profession in some ways. The way that they behaved, the way that they entertained, as we know, at their several houses, and the way that the press followed them.
At the height of her fame, Vivien spent much of 1944 filming the epic Caesar and Cleopatra in London.
Who are you?
Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt.
Vivien Leigh, the unforgettable star of Gone with the Wind, now comes to the screen in her outstanding role. The greatest woman in the history of romance and love, Cleopatra.
Of course, Vivien was an absolutely perfect Cleopatra.
You will be the most dangerous of all Caesar's conquests.
She was young, she was beautiful. She was very, very sexy. She was kittenish in a way that Elizabeth Taylor, the screen's most famous Cleopatra perhaps, could never be.
From her own lips I have heard it. You are to be her cat's paw.
It is false, I swear it.
It is true, though you swore it 1,000 times and believed all you swore.
It's the story of a girl who was a queen, but who stopped at nothing to get her own way, even with the man who had conquered her.
Vivien really, I think, was the only actress who could convey that specifically and peculiar feline quality that Cleopatra, who knows, should have had, at least should have had in Shaw's play, that's for sure.
Strike his life out as I strike his name from your lips. Dash him down from the wall. Break him on the stones. Kill, kill, kill him.
During the filming of Caesar and Cleopatra, Vivien discovered she was pregnant with Olivier's child.
On one occasion, she had to play a very energetic scene in which she takes a run, slides across the highly polished floor, leaps up several steps onto her throne, throws her hands up and says, "I am the Queen of the Nile." Vivien slipped, fell, and that was the end of her baby.
Vivien's miscarriage triggered a mental breakdown, and although she finished the film, the illness resurfaced in future years. She convalesced at Notley, channeling her energies back into her role of society hostess.
She'd have us up until 4 o'clock in the morning showing films, and when we all got up bleary-eyed in the morning, she'd have already been up for about 4 hours, and she'd organised the entire day, and we're all off again.
Olivier, of course, you know, his energy had to be much more directed into the work that he was doing, which was extremely important. And he didn't have time or the energy sometimes to extend this. And this, of course, as the years went on, became much more of a problem. And he would sometimes, I think, try and sort of slink in and sort of slip upstairs before he was spotted. But of course, you know, he did, I think, find it very exhausting.
Also, her moods were very erratic, and she'd changed from a really wonderful, wonderful hostess suddenly into a viper, and she'd latch on to somebody.
If you crossed her, if you upset her, she could be a vixen, she could be a scorpion, but that was part of her personality. She was dangerous. She could be very, very dangerous, but also she could be very, very sweet and very charming and very vulnerable.
But on the surface, they were still the golden couple. In 1948, Vivien and the newly knighted Sir Laurence Olivier went on a tour of Australia. Alongside a punishing work schedule, the couple's status kept them constantly in the public eye.
I think that the Old Vic tour was a very, very exciting thing. They were like a royal couple. It was like a royal progress. I mean, it was as if the King and Queen had come out, and the King and Queen actually couldn't come to Australia, so in a sense, almost the Oliviers went instead.
Mr. President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, ever since the day we first landed at Fremantle, we have been losing our hearts to this wonderful country of yours. It is therefore
everywhere we went. I mean, we had packed houses. It was a very, very tiring tour because for all of us, we did the 3 plays, and on top of that, the Oliviers had to be a sort of ambassadors, and they played their parts beautifully.
For once in their colourful careers, Sir Laurence and Lady Olivia were among the audience, as koalas and kangaroos strutted their stuff at Sydney's Taronga Park Zoo.
When we first met, you know, in London for The Skin of Our Teeth, they were very much in love still, you know. And on the tour, there was a great affinity between them, and we felt there was a great love there. Towards the end of the tour, when they were really very exhausted, I think things did seem to change a little bit. Whether it was because she'd met Peter Finch, whom she did fall in love with at a later date, I believe. I don't know, but it did cool a bit in the last month.
Peter Finch was then a young, promising, very promising actor on the Australian stage.
Vivien was a very, very sensual woman, and Peter was about the most sensual creature. He was just sexually instinctive. In bed, she said he was just magic. She said he just knew, he knew a woman's body.
It wasn't very long after that, when they returned to England, that, according to Olivier, Vivien came to him one day and just said to him, "I no longer love you," which was a bit of a thunderbolt.
Vivien's erratic behaviour became more unpredictable, and she was diagnosed as suffering from manic depression.
Manic depression is a horrible thing, which is fundamentally that sometimes the person is feeling very high and they can achieve anything, and nothing is a problem. And then it sort of comes to a crescendo where they kind of go over the top and behave very badly.
But it was the madness that caused her such shame, because it was such a different person who was this nightmare human being that she had no memory of, that she was so ashamed of when she would flip back into the good Vivien, if you would. The first thing she did was say, "Who have I hurt? Who have I embarrassed? Who do I need to write to apologize?" I mean, it's so moving to me. And this happened over and over again, and she did everything in her power to rise above it.
Her condition wasn't helped by her next major role as Blanche Dubois in the Tennessee Williams play A Streetcar Named Desire. It was a professional triumph, but a personal crisis.
A very difficult part for Vivien to play, and a very dangerous part for someone in her manic depressive state to play. Blanche Dubois was a woman not only on the edge of a nervous breakdown, but on the edge of mental annihilation. The play ends with her being led off to a lunatic asylum.
Larry, I believe, did say called it that awful play because he thought it affected Vivien, that it was very destructive for her. Because she was so sensitive, so highly strung herself, she must have sort of really lived it because it didn't do her much good.
However, she made a great success of it and was so successful that she was cast for the film version. That again was a new experience, because every person except Vivien Leigh in the film was a method actor or method actress. They were all drawing upon their emotional states inside themselves to get in touch with the parts. And Vivien feared to some degree to get in touch with the emotional state inside herself because it contained a degree of mental unbalance.
This is the story of a woman, Blanche Dubois, who wanted so much to stay a lady. A vivid, vibrant, exciting story, because every searching chapter was written by men.
Could it be you and me, Blanche? What does it cost for a single furs like that?
Why, these are tribute from an admirer of mine.
Well, you must have had a lot of admiration.
You lies! Lies inside and out! All lies!
Never inside! I never lied in my heart.
It was a heartbreaking performance as Blanche Dubois, and I think the film didn't help her. She had a number of terrible breakdowns, but I think Blanche Dubois was her greatest moment, in a way, both on film with Brando and on the stage over here.
The Best Actress is revealed by Ronald Colman, and A Streetcar Desire becomes the first film to win 3 acting awards. By radio in a New York dressing room, Vivien Leigh, with her husband Laurence Olivier, hears...
The winner is Vivien Leigh in A Streetcar Named Desire.
Vivien could hold a screen like few women could, but Blanche was hard to live with. Vivien was ill.
She was crazy while we were making the film because she couldn't stop partying. And even the weekends, she'd have open house.
Marry me, Mitch.
I don't think I want to marry anymore. Oh, you're not clean enough to bring in a house with money.
The pressure of the filming was appalling for her. There's no doubt that she was the kind of actress who got engulfed by her roles. There are people who say she never got out of the mood of Blanche.
She had illnesses that she was also coping with. And I was afraid she was doing herself in.
She took it home with her. And that was more than sad, that was tragic.
Vivien's next role in the film Elephant Walk was an even bigger strain for her. Her co-star was her lover, Peter Finch.
When they got to Ceylon, possibly Vivien's exhaustion, her highly nervous state, the return to the kind of sensual climate that she'd known as a child, put her immediately into a manic state in which she proceeded to make quite violent physical love to Peter Finch, disrupted the production. They didn't dare shoot some of the scenes with Vivien in the state she was in. The producer decided that they'd better go back to Hollywood, closed down the production and recast the film. Vivien went with them and had a complete nervous breakdown in Hollywood.
Olivier took Vivien home, and she was given the only treatment then available for her illness, electroconvulsive therapy, ECT.
She had this awful luck of needing shock treatments and things, and it was most distressing to see.
I went down to Notley to see her one day, and it was, I never forgot it. It was the saddest sight I've ever seen. She was being looked after by a nurse in a white uniform who never left her side, and she was kneeling on the ground digging, just digging with her fingers, you know. And she knew me only after about half an hour of my being there, but she didn't at first.
Nowadays, she would have the pills, she would have the Betty Ford clinic, she would do the comebacks. She'd be like Liz Taylor, she'd still be working at 80. But in her day, there were no pills, there were no clinics, there were no publicists, there was nobody between Vivien and an outside world which she found chilly, hostile, and sometimes, because of her mental state, could not cope with.
The strain of Vivien's illness was inevitably telling on her relationship with Olivier.
She used to be quite nasty to him, but he would just gloss over it. And I used to say to him, why do you take it? You know, why don't you argue back? He said, no, it's better. He said, it's better for me to not argue back. We'd all been out to dinner and came home and everything was all right. And then all of a sudden, Larry was pounding on our door and he said to me, would I come and help him with Vivien? So she'd suddenly gone completely berserk. And it was, you see, I don't know what their sex life was altogether, I can't say, but she always wanted more of this side of him than he was able to give. And he was just exhausted by it all, I suppose. And she was beating him across the face with a wet towel. And so he came to get me to help him. So I was shut in the bathroom with her until I got her calmed down. But I mean, you wouldn't leave her in the bathroom alone because you thought she could harm herself. She could do anything.
She said, I can't tell you how boring he is in bed. And I remember being very embarrassed. And I happened to look round at that moment and I saw his nibs. The door, you know how when a door is open you can and I could see his eye through the. And I thought, for God's sake, come in, don't listen to this conversation. She said, I lie awake there. And there he is, snoring like a hippopotamus, and I want a good... Can't use the word, apparently. She could.
And finally, the award for the Best British Actor has been won by Sir Laurence Olivier for his performance as Richard III. Here once again is Sir Laurence.
In spite of their difficulties, in public, the Oliviers continued to pretend that all was well.
May I say what a deep happiness it has been to me to have received these awards at the hands of one so dear and precious to me as she who has bestowed them.
They continued to work together too, enjoying a much publicised return to Shakespearean theatre at Stratford in 1955. Twelfth Night was the first of 3 plays.
The fun part really was Sebastian to his Viola, and I always remember I had to kiss her at the end when the twins meet, you know, and everybody said, oh, trade, you know, it's worth 1,000 quid a night. I said it was £25 a week. I was getting to kiss Vivien, and boy, could she kiss. And in that moment, it was absolute magic, because you didn't have to act.
But it was a critical disaster.
Critics, and particularly the appalling Kenneth Tynan, who has a lot to answer for in undermining Vivien's self-confidence, attacked her for having a small voice, for not filling the stage, for almost standing by waiting while Larry does his thing. But Vivien, known in this country, in the UK, as a great stage actress, was a movie star on stage, which is a big difference.
She did indeed read the critics, but what they did to Vivien, she thought, right, I'm going to get back. They're not going to do that to me a second time. And with Lady Macbeth, she took off. It's the best Lady Macbeth I've ever seen, and I've seen pretty well all of them. Vivien took her voice down. She looked, and the makeup, the rather sensual, rather cruel mouth, it was absolutely tremendous.
It was uncomfortable for some of her friends to see Vivien playing Lady Macbeth so well, because they realized that the wellspring of inspiration was coming from Vivien's mental instability.
When the new Hollywood sensation Marilyn Monroe came to London to film The Prince and the Showgirl with Olivier in 1956, Vivien made sure she won back the headlines by announcing she was pregnant. Whether it was true or not, she attracted further attention when she claimed to have had another miscarriage.
Whether she was pregnant at that time and had a miscarriage, who knows? I mean, some say yes, some say no, but she certainly announced to the world that that's what had happened. So that was very difficult indeed, and certainly sort of another step to the collapse of the marriage.
Although they continued to play their roles as a celebrity couple in public, Olivier had finally had enough.
One night, Vivien was creating a big fuss on account of being ill, but Olivier picked her up and was really intending to throw her onto the bed, but as he threw her, she caught the side of her eye on the side of a chest of drawers, and at that point, the doctors really said, you know, look, this is getting very serious, and that could have been, you know, you could have killed her, basically. It was the day before, well, one of the famous visits to the House of Parliament, when there are pictures of Vivien with an eye patch, which she said she had been bitten by a mosquito. That was not the case. And so it was almost really a decision had to be made. They must part. And after that, they never really got back together. I mean, they did and they didn't, but it was effectively over.
I think that Olivier signalled the break with Vivien by deciding to sell Notley Abbey, the place that Vivien had come to love. It was sold out almost from underneath her. I think that signalled that Olivier was going to make a new life with a new woman in his life, who was Joan Plowright.
Vivien sought revenge, trying to make everyone think Joan Plowright was to blame for the collapse of her marriage.
When Larry was doing The Entertainer, that was when he met Joan Plowright, and she really twigged that something was probably going on, and she used to go and stand at the back of the audience and harass them.
It was a very difficult time. I mean, I was not the sort of girl who breaks up marriages. We all knew that there had been the love affair with Peter Finch, and from then on that the marriage had not really been very close. She had tried to persuade him that they could go on pretending.
Well, now, how about your private life, if one may inquire?
No, one may not inquire.
One may not inquire. Well, thank you very much, Lady Livett.
So ended the romantic fantasy of their marriage, to the dismay of their fans.
People felt let down, I think, when it didn't work out. I mean, I remember my mother saying how sorry she was when they broke up. She knew them through films and so on, because they were newsworthy and you'd lived with them through their marriage and this wonderful fantasy life.
Warner Brothers takes pride in presenting an important new...
But Vivien didn't give up, once again throwing herself into her work as a respite from her mental illness. The Roman Spring of Mrs. Stone was another Tennessee Williams drama and one of her last film roles.
The Roman Spring of Mrs. Stone almost reflected the state that she was in after her divorce. That's to say, a woman who was increasingly passing through the middle age of the emotions, who felt abandoned, and yet who had got the strength of mind and will and sexuality to go on through life, gaining new experience and hoping for new love.
Oh, no.
What is it?
Oh, nothing. It's just so silly. I just lost my sunglasses.
But I'm late for an appointment.
She was marvellous. She coaxed a performance out of Warren Beatty as the young gigolo that I don't think even Warren knew he had in him.
When the time comes when nobody desires me for myself, I'd rather not be desired at all.
Warren, by the way, was going out with Joan Collins at the time. When Vivien met Joan, she just looked at Warren and said, "It's too common for you."
Vivien was living in a flat at Eaton Square by now, which she had bought with Olivier as their London base before they split up. She lived there for nearly 7 years after her divorce.
She was happy as she could be. I mean, obviously she wasn't 100% happy because she was still in love with Larry and she didn't want the divorce. But she was a realist, and once he was married to Joan Plowright and they started having children, she realised that that was it. But she never stopped loving him, never.
She wasn't happy. She had the good fortune of having Jack Merivale, who was a very nice man, an actual friend of Larry's, and he sort of stepped into the breach and looked after her, but it was never the same. I don't think somehow it was the same for Larry either. They were so perfectly matched together.
Jack Merivale was the one who took over, and Jack Merivale looked after Vivien in his last and her last years, and he was terribly good with her because you had to be really on her case all the time. You couldn't leave her. She was unreliable, she was a flake, she was sometimes suicidal, sometimes manic, sometimes very down, sometimes very up, and she needed constant care and attention.
With that disease, there is a terrible sex thing as well. You know, they become very fiendish about sex. And once, when she rang me up and asked me, said, come and have tea with me. So I said, okay, and I was there half an hour later, I suppose. By the time I got there, she was gone. And I said to the maid, well, where is she? And she said, I don't know. She just suddenly said she had to go out, and she'd be back in half an hour. And she came back. It had been pouring with rain. She was bedraggled. She looked terrible. She was covered in mud. And she'd been in the square with somebody. And things like that happened all the time.
Vivien's health continued to deteriorate. In 1967, a severe TB attack forced her to withdraw from rehearsals for a new play.
She always had a cough, you know. She was very, very thin. I mean, she was basically a small woman, but she was really thin, too thin, you know. And it was something she'd always got to fight, but she hated illness and she hated to talk about it, and she never mentioned it if she could help it. But I stopped the doctor on the way in and I said, you know, doctor, I don't think Miss Leigh's getting any better. Her cough is terrible. And he said, who's treating her, you or me? Well, I'm afraid he didn't treat her at all well, because he simply didn't know what he was doing. See, tuberculosis in the late 60s had been eradicated, more or less. I think that young doctors knew nothing much about it, and also, I think, didn't take it seriously enough. It's like a bad case of bronchitis or something, you know.
She was advised to rest. She didn't rest. She went on as much as she could. She was receiving friends, and I can't help feeling that a tiny part of her just felt, you know, that the game was up.
She was in bed, but she'd been up and done the flowers. She always said, Rosemary dear, you can't arrange flowers, and she was more than right there. So she always did them herself. And she got up and did the flowers and everything, and she was coughing a lot. And I thought, God, she really isn't getting any better, you know. And so anyway, she had a cigarette lighter she was very fond of. I think Larry had given it to her, or one of her great friends, and it needed repairing. And she said, oh, will you take this down to Phillips in Bond Street on your way home to get it repaired? And I said, my goodness, it's about 90 outside. Do you really want it to go today? And she said, oh, well, not if you really don't want to do it. So something suddenly came over me, and I said, of course I'll do it. And I'm glad I did. So I left around 4 o'clock to take the lighter to be repaired. And, you know, that was the last time I saw her.
Later that day, the 7th of July 1967, while Jack Merivale was in the flat, Vivien collapsed and died. She was just 53 years old.
Well, we were shocked. Very shocked. Yeah. Mary particularly, because she was a very great friend, my wife, and saw her through all her bad, dark periods of time, and so she felt it very deeply.
I remember the day she died being very shocked, but also somehow not surprised. Somehow she always seemed as though she wasn't going to make it. And it was, again, rather like Judy Garland's death. You were sorry for yourself at losing her, but you weren't entirely surprised. And somewhere in the background, there was a kind of relief. You thought, oh God, she's out of it. Because there had been so much emotional pain, so much physical pain, so much agony, so many disastrous moments with the press, so many problems. You thought, thank God she can rest.
Vivien's memorial service at St Martin in the Fields in Trafalgar Square was attended by many leading figures from the stage and screen.
I remember Vivien as I remember Larry, for laughs. They were a wonderful couple to be with, funny and amusing, and I always remember the laughs we had with them.
What I remember of Vivien was an absolute human being. Very beautiful, with a lot of wonderful qualities, and terribly flawed. And she could be the sweetest, kindest friend. She could be an absolute bitch.
And yet then, just when you wanted to kill her for being so tiresome and so dotty, she could break your heart because she was magic, and you did feel that she was like a space traveller. She didn't seem to belong to the 20th century at all.
She was a clever person, and I think a very great actress indeed, but above all, she was a movie star par excellence.